They called him the Angel of Death, but before the name clung to him like smoke, Josef Mengele was just another ambitious doctor chasing recognition. In the quiet lecture halls of Munich, he studied anthropology, medicine, and genetics, convinced that science could explain why some lives were worth more than others. By the time the Second World War spread across Europe, that belief had hardened into something monstrous. Mengele joined the SS in 1938, his sharp mind and charm making him stand out among the ranks. He was not the kind of man who shouted or raged. He smiled, polite and confident, the kind of man who could greet you kindly before condemning you to die. His rise through the Nazi system was quick, helped by powerful mentors who believed in the same poisonous idea of racial purity. One of them was Professor Ottmar von Verschuer, a respected geneticist obsessed with heredity and twins. Together, they dreamed of proving through science that one race was superior to all others. Mengele's loyalty and medical skill made him a perfect fit for their experiments. When he volunteered for frontline duty as a medical officer, he saw action on the Eastern Front, treating wounded soldiers. But in 1942, a grenade explosion ended his combat career. Wounded but decorated, he returned to Germany with medals on his chest and a hunger for purpose. That purpose soon found him in the form of Auschwitz. In May 1943, the 20-something doctor arrived at the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp stretched endlessly before him, smoke rising from chimneys, the air heavy with ash. The railway tracks led straight to the heart of the killing complex. To Mengele, it was not horror, but opportunity. Here was a laboratory disguised as a death camp, a place where thousands of lives arrived each day, ready to be sorted, measured, and discarded. When trains arrived filled with exhausted families, Mengele stood on the ramp in his spotless uniform, gloved hand pointing left or right. One direction meant labor, the other meant death. Witnesses remembered his calmness, even elegance, as he carried out selections. He hummed under his breath, sometimes even smiling as children clung to their mothers, unaware that their fate was already sealed. But not every child was sent immediately to the gas chambers. Mengele had a special interest in twins and those with unusual features, especially eye colors that did not match. Those children were set aside for research, sent to the barracks he controlled. To them, he seemed gentle at first, offering sweets, speaking softly. They could not imagine that the same man would later order their blood drawn until they fainted or their bodies examined after death. In his mind, he was not a murderer, but a scientist serving a higher cause. Every measurement, every sample, was part of an experiment to prove the twisted logic of Nazi racial theory. The camp gave him everything he wanted: unlimited subjects, no oversight, and the protection of the SS. Over time, his presence on the selection ramp became iconic in its cruelty. The tilt of his hand decided who would breathe and who would not. Behind the calm voice and polished boots hid a man who saw human life as material. In the sterile light of the laboratory and the filth of the barracks, Josef Mengele's true career began. What had started in the lecture halls of Germany now unfolded among the ashes of Auschwitz, where science and evil became indistinguishable, and the doctor who once studied life became its most precise destroyer. The experiments at Auschwitz were not the work of a single madman. They were part of a network, a cold machine of research that stretched from the killing grounds of Poland to the clean laboratories of Berlin. At its center stood two men bound by ambition and belief. In Berlin, Professor Ottmar von Verschuer directed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. In Auschwitz, his former student, Josef Mengele, carried out the work that would feed the professor's files and fuel his theories. They saw themselves as scientists on the edge of discovery. To the world, their discoveries would become proof of how science could be turned into a weapon. The connection between them was not secret. Letters, reports, and specimen shipments moved steadily along the Nazi rail lines. Mengele had the bodies, von Verschuer had the equipment, and both shared a faith in racial hierarchy disguised as genetics. Prisoners in Auschwitz were the test material. They did not have names in the reports, only numbers, measurements, and notes about eye color or skull shape. When twins were selected from new arrivals, they were catalogued, photographed, and examined. Blood samples were drawn and preserved. When the children died, their organs were carefully removed and packed into jars. The labels bore neat handwriting, Destination Berlin. Scientists in Berlin opened those containers as if they were simple deliveries of research specimens. Few asked where they came from. Fewer still cared. For them, the camp was a distant extension of the laboratory, an endless supply chain of human material. Mengele's reports to von Verschuer often described his subjects in scientific language, as though they were insects or rare plants. The tone was clinical, detached, written to impress. In return, von Verschuer praised him, requested more samples, and arranged for funding that kept the flow of work alive. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and complete moral blindness. Within Nazi Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute stood as a symbol of prestige. Its scientists lectured about purity, heredity, and national health. Behind the polished doors, they studied specimens sent from the camps. Bones, tissue, and eyes became proof of theories claiming that entire groups of people were biologically inferior. Every shipment from Auschwitz was treated like data, another piece of evidence to justify genocide. Mengele's experiments fit perfectly into this structure. He was the field worker, gathering results from living and dying subjects. The institute was the hub, processing those results into academic papers and lectures. Even as the war turned against Germany, this pipeline of death and data continued. In 1944, Mengele sent samples from twin autopsies and eye dissections to von Verschuer, who presented them to the German scientific community as groundbreaking research. No one challenged him. The collapse of the Third Reich would later expose how deeply science had been corrupted, but in those years, the work moved with precision. The trains that carried prisoners to Auschwitz also carried the remains of victims back to Berlin. For the doctors who served the regime, this was not murder but method, not crime but curiosity. The link between the camp and the institute was the heart of Nazi medical science, where intellect and cruelty were joined by the same steady hand. In Auschwitz, the hunt for anomalies began the moment the train doors opened. Mengele's sharp eyes scanned the crowd not just for the strong or weak, but for the strange, the unique, the different. Among thousands of faces, he looked for pairs of twins or for a flash of colour that did not match. Blue and brown in the same set of eyes. A freckle pattern that broke symmetry. Anything that could feed his obsession with heredity. When guards shouted orders and families were torn apart, Mengele moved calmly between them, pointing out children to be pulled from the lines. Sometimes he would crouch to meet their gaze, speaking softly, almost kindly, before sending them away from the path that led to the gas chambers. To the frightened children, it felt like mercy. In truth, it was selection of a different kind. The twins were marched together into the camp, confused but alive. They were assigned to special barracks that Mengele controlled. There, every inch of their bodies became data. Prisoner nurses and assistants, many of them doctors from across Europe forced to serve him, carried out endless rounds of measurements. The children stood barefoot on cold floors, while calipers traced the shapes of their skulls and rulers marked the distance between their eyes. Photographs were taken from every angle, front and side, face and profile. Each image was carefully labelled with camp numbers, names, and notes. The doctor wanted perfection in his records. He believed that by comparing twins he could unlock the secrets of heredity, that their bodies could prove which traits were born in the blood and which were shaped by life. But the eyes fascinated him most. Those small coloured orbs became the centre of his curiosity. Children with unusual eyes were photographed under harsh lights. He examined them with magnifying lenses, recording shades of blue, brown, green, and grey. If one twin had darker eyes than the other, it was treated like a puzzle he could solve. Blood samples were taken daily. Drops of pigment were tested in crude ways to see if colour could be changed. When a child died, their eyes were preserved in jars, labelled for shipment to Berlin. Some of the children began to understand what his interest meant. They whispered among themselves in the barracks, calling him the doctor with two faces. In front of them he smiled, but behind that smile waited the instruments and the notebooks. Prisoner assistants tried to comfort the younger ones, though they too knew that every measurement brought the children closer to death. Mengele moved between his subjects like a collector examining rare specimens. He recorded differences with precision, believing he was building a scientific legacy that would outlast the war. To the Nazis, these children were not human beings, but living charts, proof for a theory that never existed. Inside the laboratory, the doctor's obsession with eyes and twins blurred the line between study and slaughter. In his notebooks, he saw order. Outside, in the barracks, the children saw fear reflected in every polished lens that stared back at them. In the quiet halls of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, a zoologist named Karin Magnusson studied the human eye as though it were a piece of coloured glass. She had joined the Nazi Party long before the war began, drawn by its promises of racial purity and the idea that science could separate the superior from the flawed. Her specialty was iris pigmentation, and she was fascinated by a rare condition known as heterochromia, when a person's eyes are two different colours. To her, it was not beauty, but evidence of imperfection, something to be studied and corrected. But the human eyes she wanted were not easy to find, at least not in Berlin. For that, she needed Joseph Mengele. In Auschwitz, Mengele had already built his grim collection of twins and children marked by physical differences. When he came across a Sinti family whose children had mismatched eyes, he saw not people but specimens. Their condition was exactly what Magnusson wanted. Communication between the camp and the institute moved quietly through letters and coded requests. Magnusson proposed experiments to determine if eye colour could be changed by chemical treatment. Mengele agreed to provide her with material for study. Inside the camp, the Sinti children were taken to the laboratory. The doctor told them he wanted to make their eyes better. He ordered drops to be placed into their eyes, solutions that burned and blurred their vision. Prisoner nurses were forced to carry out his orders, wiping tears from children who cried from pain but did not dare to scream. The experiments continued for days, sometimes weeks, with the children growing weaker and more frightened. Their families begged for mercy, but in Auschwitz, mercy did not exist. When the trials ended, the children were no longer needed. Mengele arranged for their deaths. Witnesses later recalled that he personally chose the time and place. The bodies were brought to the dissection room, where the eyes were carefully removed. Each pair was placed into a glass jar filled with preservative fluid, labelled with the camp number, and packed for shipment. Somewhere in Berlin, Magnusson received those jars. She studied them under her microscope, taking notes on pigmentation and structure. To her, the eyes were data, proof of her theories. She never visited the camp, never saw the faces of the children whose lives she had destroyed through her curiosity. The distance between the laboratory and the gas chambers allowed her to believe she was simply doing research. Years later, she defended her work as scientific, not criminal, though every page of her notebooks was written in the language of death. The Sinti family was erased, their names lost to the smoke of Auschwitz. Only their eyes remained, trapped in jars on a Berlin shelf. Magnuson never faced trial after the war. She continued teaching biology, her past largely hidden, while the world tried to understand how educated people could turn children into specimens. The story of her project is a reminder that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through laboratories, disguised as science, carried out by hands that believe they are only studying life while destroying it completely. Morning in the children's barracks began with the whistle of guards and the clatter of boots on frozen ground. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed clothes, damp straw, and fear. The children slept in rows, packed tightly on wooden bunks that creaked under their weight. Some were as young as 5, others barely teenagers. Twins were always kept together, their heads shaved, numbers tattooed on their arms in blue ink. When the door opened, they sat up instantly, knowing that hesitation meant punishment. Outside, the sun had not yet broken through the smoke that drifted from the chimneys. Roll call came first. The children lined up in the yard, shivering in thin uniforms, their breath turning white in the cold. A guard shouted names and numbers while Mengele or one of his assistants walked along the line, clipboard in hand. Sometimes he stopped to study a face, tilting a chin up with his gloved hand. To him, they were specimens, not children. When the counting ended, they were led to the examination rooms. Inside, everything smelled of disinfectant and metal. Cameras stood on tripods, lights glaring like the sun. The children were photographed again and again, from every angle, front view, side view, close-up of eyes. Each photograph captured not personality or memory, but data. Afterward came the measuring. Calipers traced the width of skulls. Tape measures wrapped around foreheads and arms. Every fraction was written down by assistants who tried to avoid eye contact with the frightened children. The work had a rhythm, mechanical and cold. Next came the blood draws. The youngest cried as the needles pierced their skin. For some, blood was taken daily, sometimes from both arms. They grew dizzy, but the doctors never paused. Samples were labelled and sent for analysis. Prisoner nurses whispered words of comfort, but their voices trembled. They had seen too much to offer hope. When a child fainted, a guard dragged them aside, and the work continued. After the tests, the children were sent back to their barracks. They sat quietly on their bunks, holding their arms, their eyes red from exhaustion. The older ones tried to keep the younger calm, telling them stories from home, even though home felt like a dream they could no longer remember. The sound of the camp carried through the thin walls, dogs barking, shouts in German, the distant hum of trucks. At noon, watery soup and a piece of bread were handed out. They ate quickly, knowing the food could be taken away without warning. In the afternoon, more examinations awaited them. Sometimes Mengele arrived himself, stepping into the barracks with polished boots and a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke softly, calling some children by pet names, asking how they felt, pretending to care. The children wanted to believe him, but they saw the notebooks he carried, the way his eyes lingered on their faces like a collector inspecting fragile objects. Night brought no rest. The lamps stayed dim, the cold crept in, and whispers filled the dark. They spoke of home, of parents they hoped to see again, though deep down many knew the truth. In Auschwitz, the days blurred together. Each sunrise brought the same routine of photographs, needles, and numbers, until even the children began to forget who they were beyond the labels inked on their skin. In the end, the experiments always led to the same place. When the notes were complete and the photographs stacked neatly on Mengele's desk, the children who had been studied were no longer needed. They were summoned one by one, often without warning. Sometimes they were told they were going to another test, a new measurement, or a medical check. Few resisted. By then, most were too weak or too frightened to question anything. The killing took place in the same clinical silence that surrounded all of Mengele's work. Prisoner doctors, forced to assist, called it the procedure. Among them was Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian Jewish physician who had been spared execution to work in the autopsy rooms. He later wrote about what he saw in detail that haunted him until his death. The children were brought into a small room near the crematorium, their arms trembling, eyes wide. A needle waited on a metal tray. The injection was not violent. It was quiet, almost tender in its deceit. The liquid that entered their veins stopped the heart within seconds. Niesli described how they fell without a sound, their bodies suddenly weightless, as if sleep had overtaken them. The SS doctors preferred this method because it left the bodies intact, perfect for dissection. Once the room fell still, the doors opened and the next phase began. The corpses were carried to the dissecting tables, still warm, under harsh lamps. Mengele's assistants began their work. Eyes were removed carefully, washed, and placed into labelled jars filled with preserving fluid. Organs were weighed and measured. The twin pairs were compared even in death, their features recorded with precision. For Mengele, this was the completion of a study. For Niesli and the other prisoner doctors, it was a descent into horror they could never escape. He wrote that Mengele sometimes observed these autopsies in silence, his face calm, hands behind his back. He might nod occasionally, as though approving a successful experiment. The children he had once spoken to gently now lay opened on the table, their humanity reduced to numbers and samples. The eyes, always the eyes, fascinated him. He wanted to understand why colours differed, why one iris shimmered blue and another brown. Each jar of preserved eyes was destined for Berlin, a shipment to his mentor, Professor von Verschwer. Those glass containers, packed in crates, travelled hundreds of miles to laboratories where scientists pretended not to know what price had been paid for them. Inside the camp, Niesli and others were left to clean the room, to prepare for the next victims. They washed the tables, burned the waste, and tried not to look at the small shoes and clothes left behind. The smell of formalin clung to their hands. Some whispered prayers under their breath, knowing that speaking too loudly could cost them their lives. In Auschwitz, even death became routine. Mengele recorded his findings, filed his notes, and waited for new twins to arrive on the next transport. For him, science had no boundaries, no conscience, only curiosity. But for those who witnessed it, the memory of the injections and the autopsies would never fade. Niesli wrote later that he had watched the destruction of innocence turned into an experiment, and that nothing could wash the blood from the hands of the man who called it research. They arrived at Auschwitz in May of 1944, a family of 10 travelling together under the name Ovitz. They were musicians, performers from a small village in Transylvania, known across Hungary as the Lilliput Troupe. 7 of them were dwarfs, brothers and sisters, who sang, acted, and played instruments for a living. They had survived together through war, poverty, and persecution, clinging to one another as their only protection. When the train stopped and the doors opened, they stepped onto the ramp, expecting death. But what awaited them was something far stranger. Mengele noticed them immediately. Their size, their family ties, and their fame intrigued him. Here, in front of him, stood a living collection, a perfect group for study. Unlike most prisoners, the Auschwitz family was not sent to the gas chambers. They were taken instead to special quarters inside the camp. The barracks were still filthy and cold, but they were given extra food and blankets, not out of kindness, but because Mengele wanted to keep them alive for as long as his curiosity lasted. Each member of the family was measured repeatedly. Calipers traced the shapes of their skulls, rulers recorded the length of limbs, and X-rays captured every bone. Their eyes were photographed under bright lamps, their teeth counted, their hair plucked for samples. Blood was drawn almost daily. Prisoner doctors and nurses, terrified of Mengele, carried out his orders. Though some tried to be gentle with the Auschwitzes when they could, the tests seemed endless. Mengele wanted to compare the dwarfs with their average-sized relatives, convinced that their difference in height could reveal secrets about heredity. He often visited them himself, asking questions, taking notes, and observing them like rare animals in a cage. To the Auschwitz family, he was both their captor and their only protection. As long as he was interested, they lived. When he lost interest, they knew they would die. They learned to smile when he entered, to answer politely, to perform when he asked. On some days, he made them sing for visiting SS officers. The family's fragile survival depended on keeping him entertained, but the experiments were far from harmless. He ordered dental and spinal examinations that left them bruised and in pain. Samples of their bone marrow were taken without anesthesia. He inspected the women's reproductive organs, convinced that dwarfism was linked to genetic weakness. Each test stripped away more of their dignity. Yet the Auschwitz family endured together. They shared their meagre rations, comforted one another, and prayed in whispers each night. They refused to let the camp erase their sense of family. When Auschwitz was evacuated in January of 1945, they were among the few still alive in Mengele's collection. They were liberated by Soviet forces weeks later, frail but breathing. For years after the war, they carried scars, both visible and invisible. They spoke publicly about their time in Auschwitz, explaining that their survival was both a blessing and a burden. They had lived because they fascinated a man who believed himself a scientist. The Auschwitz family's story revealed the cruel heart of Nazi experimentation, where human beings were reduced to specimens and survival depended not on luck or strength, but on the twisted interests of the Angel of Death. When Irene and Renee were freed from Auschwitz in January of 1945, they were only 10 years old, yet they carried memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Twins from Czechoslovakia, they had been taken from their family when the train doors opened on the ramp. The guards had shouted, and in the chaos, the two children clung to each other. Mengele noticed them almost instantly. He pointed at them with a smile, calling out the word that sealed their fate, Zwillinge, twins. From that moment, their lives no longer belonged to them. They were sent to the children's barracks, placed among dozens of other twins who shared the same hollow look of confusion and fear. Every day began with footsteps in the mud, the sound of guards shouting, and the smell of chemicals drifting from the laboratories. Irene remembered how the prisoners whispered his name before he entered. When Mengele arrived, the room fell silent. He wore white gloves, his boots polished to a shine, his face calm. To the children, he looked more like a doctor from a hospital than a man from a nightmare. At first, he spoke gently, asking questions through interpreters. He gave the twins extra bread, smiled, and sometimes patted their heads. Irene said that his kindness terrified her more than his cruelty, because she could feel that something was wrong behind the smile. Soon the experiments began. Blood was drawn from one twin and injected into the other. Needles filled their days. They grew weak, their arms bruised and swollen. Each morning, they lined up for examinations that seemed to have no purpose. Doctors measured their skulls, compared their eyes, and noted every detail in notebooks. When one twin grew ill, both were tested. Irene recalled lying on a cold metal table, staring at a light too bright to look at, while men in white coats spoke in German she could not understand. She felt like an object, not a person. Renee remembered the fear of the injections most clearly. The syringes were large, the liquid unknown. Sometimes they fainted, sometimes they vomited. The nurses, themselves prisoners, tried to comfort them, whispering that it would soon be over. But it never seemed to end. Each day brought more tests, more blood, more pain. They saw other twins disappear, taken away, and never returning. The children learned not to ask questions. They learned to stay silent, to look down, to obey. After liberation, Irene and Renee were among the few survivors of Mengelé's experiments. They later spoke publicly, not for revenge, but so the world would know. They described how the doctor who claimed to study life had surrounded himself with death, how his curiosity destroyed the very children he claimed to protect. Their voices joined those of other twins who lived to remember, each story a piece of the same horror. What they carried from Auschwitz was not just pain, but proof that science without humanity can become a weapon sharper than any knife. Through their words, the children of Auschwitz still speak, reminding the world what happens when compassion is replaced by coldness in the name of knowledge. In January of 1945, the snow around Auschwitz turned red with mud as the camp began to empty. The Soviet army was advancing fast, and the SS moved quickly to erase what they could. Fires burned in pits, papers were destroyed, and the prisoners who could still walk were forced out onto the roads in long columns. Those who could not were left to die where they lay. Amid the chaos, Joseph Mengele gathered his notebooks and specimens. He knew his time at Auschwitz was over, but he had no intention of facing justice. He left the camp quietly, dressed not as a doctor, but as an officer among thousands retreating west. The angel of death vanished into the storm. When Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz at the end of January, they found the barracks almost empty. Inside the laboratories, glass jars still lined the shelves, filled with preserved organs and eyes. The evidence of experiments was everywhere, but the man who had ordered them was gone. Mengele moved through Germany, disguised under false papers. He was briefly captured by American forces later that year, but released because his name was not yet widely known. He slipped away before his crimes reached the headlines of Nuremberg. In the years that followed, he lived like a shadow. With the help of former SS networks, he escaped Europe through Italy, travelling on a false passport under the name Helmut Gregor. By 1949, he had reached Argentina, a country that welcomed thousands of Nazi fugitives. There, he blended easily into German communities, working as a mechanic and later as a small business owner. Photographs from those years show him smiling at social gatherings, tanned and healthy, a man who looked like any other European immigrant. No one who saw him would have guessed he had once decided the fates of children with the tilt of a hand. In the following decades, he moved from Argentina to Paraguay and then Brazil, always one step ahead of investigators. Even as the world learned the full horror of Auschwitz, Mengele remained free. Survivors testified, newspapers published his name, and governments promised to find him, yet the trail always went cold. His mentor, Ottmar von Verschwer, kept his university post after the war, never charged, continuing his research until retirement. Karin Magnusson also escaped justice, teaching quietly in Germany for years. The entire chain of doctors and scientists who had handled the eyes and organs of murdered children largely returned to ordinary lives. Mengele, however, became a ghost story, a name whispered with anger and disbelief. He lived in hiding for more than 3 decades, moving between safe houses, growing older and more paranoid. In February of 1979, while swimming near Sao Paulo, he suffered a stroke and drowned. His death went unnoticed for years. Only in 1985 did forensic tests confirm his identity, closing the search but not the wound. Justice had come too late. The children he killed had no graves, only memories carried by those who survived. The doctor who had once ruled the ramp at Auschwitz died quietly on a beach, far from the screams and the smoke, leaving behind the chilling truth that some of history's worst crimes can outlive the reach of punishment. When the war ended in 1945, the gates of Auschwitz stood open and silent, surrounded by snow and ash. The world began to see what had happened inside, and for a moment, even those who had fought in the war could not believe that such things had been done in the name of science. The discovery of laboratories filled with preserved organs, jars of human eyes, and notebooks describing experiments on children stunned the Allied investigators. In Nuremberg, the trial of Nazi doctors began in December of 1946. 23 physicians stood accused of crimes against humanity. Joseph Mengele was not among them. He had already vanished, leaving others to face the questions that would define a generation. How could medicine, built to heal, be twisted into a tool for murder? Testimonies from survivors and captured doctors revealed the scope of the cruelty. Prisoners had been frozen, infected, and dissected. Children had been treated like laboratory animals. Every rule of humanity had been broken under the excuse of research. The tribunal produced the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles that would become the foundation of modern medical ethics. It declared that no experiment could be done without voluntary consent, that the good of the subject must come before the interests of science, and that unnecessary suffering should never be allowed. Those words were written as an answer to Auschwitz, to the laboratories of the Angel of Death, and to the countless victims whose bodies were used without choice or mercy. Yet the reckoning did not end with the trials. In the years that followed, museums, historians, and survivors fought to preserve the evidence. The Auschwitz Museum kept the rooms where the experiments took place, the metal tables, the instruments, and the fragments of reports found after liberation. Libraries in Germany and the United States collected the writings of witnesses like Miklos Niisli and the testimonies of twin survivors such as Irene and Renee. Their words became the voice of the dead. Universities across the world began to teach the ethics born from their suffering. Every doctor, every scientist was reminded that knowledge without conscience is dangerous, but justice was never complete. Many who had worked alongside Mengele lived freely, some even returning to research. Documents that passed through their hands before the war ended up hidden in archives, and only decades later did historians uncover their full meaning. In the 1960s and 70s, survivors began to speak publicly, not to seek revenge, but to prevent forgetting. They told schoolchildren, journalists, and teachers about the eyes in jars, the needles, and the false kindness that masked cruelty. Their courage ensured that memory would outlive the silence. Today, museums and memorials across the world display the photographs and names of the children who were studied and killed. Each exhibit stands as a warning of what happens when science loses its soul. The story of Mengele and his victims is not only about evil, but about responsibility. It asks every generation to look inward and to remember that progress without empathy is hollow. The children of Auschwitz never chose to become part of history. Yet through their suffering, they changed it forever, leaving behind lessons that still guide medicine, law, and the conscience of the world.